Okay, in this section, we wanted to ask for your help. Um, when I started at Georgia State University, my first doctoral student, Stacy McElroy, helped name our lab. So we ended up calling the lab the Humility and Positive Psychology Interventions Lab, or the Happy Lab. And that's stuck. Here we are, almost 15 years later. And we wanted to give you a chance to help with naming this course. So, what you signed up for was just a simple positive psychology, but we probably need something a little flashier and wanted to get your creativity going to help us with that. So, I thought I'd give a little bit of context for why we ended up revising this course. A couple of years ago, Sally Lee and I applied for a grant um, that came through. It was a Life Worth Living Pedagogy Network that was going through Yale University, which is where I did my undergraduate work. And it was through a scholar named Miroslav Volf. And I had done a consultation with him where he was writing a book on humility and joy. And I went up there to join a group of other people who were kind of doing work on humility, and it was a really cool creative process, and I was really attracted to the way that they did creative work. So instead of just reading people's books and papers and various things, he made the process very in vivo. So he would just invite the people that he wanted to engage, give everyone a chance to kind of write up a paper and present it to the group. Actually, what he had people do is you would read somebody else's paper and kind of give some comments, and then there would be a discussion. And he would just kind of sit there with these giant 5x8 cards and take notes about what seemed most interesting from the discussion. And I guess that would go into a bucket. And when it came time for him to write his chapter on humility and joy, he would go back and kind of revisit this dialogue that we had. So it was a really cool process. I made a number of friends there that I still am in touch with, and a lot of the ideas that I've worked on over the past 10 years, I can kind of trace back to some of those discussions. I actually ran into a friend that I hadn't seen since I graduated around 2003. His name is Matt, and he's one of the co-authors on the Life Worth Living book that they wrote, that's kind of related to this course. So I really did get invited into a community, and so we're hoping that this course can have a similar kind of process of inviting you into a creative and learning community. So I thought I would tell you some of the things that I was attracted to, and made me want to, kind of stay connected to this group. But I'm hoping that you, as well as you kind of engage some of the ideas, and we assigned the book that Miroslav and Matt and Ryan wrote. I'd be curious to hear what resonates with you. And, I think one way to kind of consolidate that is to kind of work it into a title. So when we have our, kind of retreat day, I'll unveil my idea for a title, but I think it'd be kind of fun for the whole group to discuss what we think might be a good title for this course in future years. A couple of quick thoughts on what I was attracted to. So when I was a undergrad at Yale, I had to do a senior thesis to graduate, and I didn't really know what I was going to do, but I had taken a lot of courses on history of religion, philosophy of religion. I was interested in religion. I was also, I started out a poli-sci major, but then I ended up switching to psychology. And I was interested in how in the world would you kind of integrate counseling with multicultural issues like religion. And almost all the courses I took at Yale were more basic science courses, so things like social psychology or developmental psychology, and they were describing kind of studies that were happening in the lab. But I did take one course on clinical psychology, and it went through some of the different approaches to psychotherapy, but they really didn't talk much about how you would adapt therapy to different kinds of cultural groups. And I don't remember them mentioning much of anything about religion. The only thing I remember was that there was starting to be a line of work on how religion was related to health. And so some of the kind of ideas that founding members like Freud had about religion were more negative, but then I think it was complicating the story that there also seemed to be some benefits of religious involvement in some cases for health and mental health. So I do remember them kind of briefly covering that, but I was wondering how to put these things together. So to me, the theme of forgiveness seemed like something where there might be overlap between these different disciplines. And so I ended up kind of connecting with Miroslav's work. And at one point, he visited a group that I was a part of and gave a talk. And he had a book on kind of forgiveness and reconciliation in the context of like ethnic conflict. It was kind of like a political theology book. It's called Exclusion and Embrace, and it was highly acclaimed, but it was kind of integrating work in theology, but also from the social sciences on what's going on when there's kind of an escalation of intergroup conflict. And anyway, that was kind of my initial connection with his team, but I didn't write a very good paper. I didn't really know what I was doing, and I didn't have a lot of support. But I ended up reading his work. I ended up reading who would eventually become my mentor, Everett Worthington. I read his work on forgiveness. I also read some different things on the integration of theology and psychology, and it was basically like psychology is relatively new. The approach to psychotherapy that's kind of become popular in the U.S. and other Western countries. But traditions of soul care go much further back in human history, and so I read some people kind of trying to integrate what we knew before 1930 and afterwards. So that was kind of my senior thesis, and I was mostly just kind of starting to explore. And here we are, really 20 years later, and it's kind of easy to trace back and see some of those early roots in my current work. So my current work is focused on humility, and I have a large grant that we're running right now, $6.6 million, looking at humility towards ideas, kind of humility towards, sometimes even ideas that are formative to your sense of who you are. Some people call that like a worldview. So how is it that we can practice humility when we're highly committed and there are commitment-related biases associated with our ideas? So it could be like politics, religion, other kinds of cultural identities, but sometimes ideas kind of are like load-bearing walls. So there was definitely a conceptual attraction that I had to some of Wolf's work. Y'all are welcome to read the grant that we wrote, but they had us write kind of a diversity statement, and one of the things that I was really attracted to from their group, just spending a little bit of time with them, is they seem to have some cultural norms for exchanging ideas that would protect friendship, even if people were coming from different perspectives and possibly even very different perspectives. And so I had read a book by Wolf on kind of interfaith trust building. one of the ones that I read was kind of more for a popular audience, and it was called Allah, A Christian Response. But he, in a certain section, which I've kind of put into our materials, he describes some norms for kind of applying the golden rule to your relationships across cultural difference. And he was talking about specifically Christian relationships with Muslims, but I kind of adapted his language and kind of used it. Our lab and team, we kind of tweaked it and adapted it for the norms that we would use in our creative work with each other. So that was something that I wanted to learn from their group. And then another thing, I have a sense of purpose and calling to try to help the early career phase be easier to navigate for people. So, y'all are in a phase of possibly considering careers in psychology. One of the things we'd like to do in this course is make it easier for you to think about what that could look like and have it feel less daunting. The way that this pedagogical network was structured, it seemed to be encouraging to people who, honestly, if you're in philosophy or religious studies or theology and you're wanting to go into academia, it can be kind of a daunting job market. There are parts of psychology that are that way. So, for example, I have a friend, Daryl Van Tongeren, who's a social psychologist, and because of there's not an abundance of jobs. And so sometimes after people get their PhD, they'll need to do a postdoc for a number of years. Sometimes kind of jokingly, I talk about it as postdoc purgatory. But it's kind of like you're in a waiting period for a job to come about. Well, in some of the disciplines in the humanities, if you're wanting a tenure track job, you actually might be waiting a fairly long time for a really strong opportunity to come about. And some people are essentially working on soft money positions. So that's, the university isn't guaranteeing the position, but the position is based on continuing to receive grant funding. So there were some elements where I saw similar challenges in this other discipline, and I liked some of the creative ways that they were helping early career people support each other. So these are some of the things that I was attracted to in their group. And the last thing that I'll mention is my sense of what helps people kind of navigate that phase of life of kind of figuring out what to do with a career is you partially have to see other people enjoying the work, and you can kind of start to have empathy and imagine what it might be like. So for me, for example, I didn't really have any idea of being a professor until I got into a doc program, and my mentor, Everett Worthington, in the first semester I was there, just made it look really fun. Like my idea of doing research was that you were kind of doing a lot of solo work, and I didn't think I would really like it. I didn't particularly like my stats undergrad course, so a lot of it seemed not very attractive, what I had been exposed to so far. And then, in working with Ev and seeing what his creative work was like, it just took on a whole new meaning. So he had just gotten back from a sabbatical where he was traveling all around the world. And then, I kind of caught him in his first semester back. He invited me into the process of writing with him and, gave me a lot of feedback. I hadn't traditionally liked English classes or things like that because it kind of felt confusing. It seemed like every teacher kind of had different things they wanted, and it just wasn't a class that it was easy for me to kind of figure out what I was supposed to be doing. But within, my first year of working with Ev, I really could see myself making huge gains in learning to be a writer. And he had written like 30 books and, several hundred articles. So I was like, oh, shoot, if I work really hard and he gives me feedback, I'm going to get better at this. And, so there was something about it that just felt very motivating and engaging. And my expectations were totally different than what it was. So these are the things that I was attracted to in kind of engaging with this network of scholars, at Yale University. I'm curious. By the end of this course, one of the assignments that we'll have you do at the end is to write a one pager and give us what you think the title should be, and you can kind of give us your reasons for thinking that we should consider your title, and it can be kind of a friendly competition. What are we trying to do in this course? I wanted to say a few things. So we are part of a larger pedagogical network. Most of the other courses that are part of the Life Worth Living network are happening within humanities programs. And so we are kind of initial pilot test of integrating similar kinds of ideas into social sciences. So one way to think about this is the course that Matt and Ryan and Miroslav taught at Yale was kind of a reaction to a very, very popular positive psychology course by Laurie Santos at Yale. So it's one of the more popular undergrad courses. I'm not sure if they still do shopping periods. So when I went through the first 2 weeks, you could go to any class you wanted, and you had 2 weeks to you could listen to the first lecture or two and decide if you wanted to stay in the course. So a course like Lori's might end up having 1,000 people in it, and they have to get a new room because of how many people go into this course. Well, um, this humanities group kind of offered a cultural and humanities critique of positive psych. So if you kind of look at what they're doing in their course, it's asking very practical questions about purpose and meaning in life and kind of existential kinds of questions that everyone has to kind of deal with in their own lives. These are kind of universal questions. And they tried to order them, and then they tried to sample from a variety of religious and secular traditions how they might answer these questions. Um, and so that's kind of what's in common across these different humanities courses. So in a way, our course is almost like after there's the normal way to teach positive psychology. There are these kind of humanities critiques, and then this is kind of a third movement in the conversation. This is a counseling psychologist saying, okay, if we kind of put the two together, what do we get? So that's one way of thinking about what we're trying to do with this course. The um, the pedagogical network has four principles that you can kind of look at, and I put a link to that you could kind of skim some of their resources. There's a focus on existential meaning. I think that's kind of easy to achieve. Our content areas fit well within that. Number two, truth-seeking pluralism. Um, this is one I'd like to talk more about on our retreat day, and so I'll kind of flag that. But I think this is really important to give you kind of a teaser. If you were to train as either a master's level counselor or a PhD level psychologist, you would take a course on group counseling. And one of the most important things that happens early in a group is there's a process of norming, and the leader has an important responsibility to kind of set the norms of a group. If you wanted to read a really uh, kind of accessible book on what it's like to be a hospitable host for a group, I'd recommend The Art of Gathering. But anyway, so I'll kind of revisit that. Number three, first person engagement. So we're not going to just abstractly kind of read and you know, discuss in some kind of depersonalized way. So this is actually more common in counseling and psychology, especially graduate training, because you are potentially moving into a helping role and you're learning to kind of develop empathy and other helping skills. There's a lot of process. There's a lot of things where you're kind of learning to practice certain relational skills in the training. So it's not graduate school in counseling or psychology is not uh, academically really, really, really challenging. It's kind of similar to other types of work. If you do a PhD, doing a dissertation is kind of a larger scope of project, but really one of the parts that's challenging about graduate training is learning to kind of move into these professional roles, and some of them involve, kind of sitting with people that are in distress and having strong feelings, and those strong feelings can kind of bring up our own strong feelings. So anyway, so that number three is kind of consistent with our existing training. Number four, participate in a community of practice. I think this is also consistent with principles of training in counseling and psychology. So, for example, if you came to our master's program, we have a cohort model, and we try to keep those cohorts between 15 and 30 people. And we haven't moved towards, online only training. And one of the reasons why is there's an acculturation process that's happening when you're becoming a counselor or a psychologist. And so part of what's happening with a lot of in-person training and relationship building is you're starting to acculturate to the expectations of a new professional role. And that really is, it's a high trust role in society. And if you don't do your job well, it can really hurt the profession's reputation. So I actually think that idea is central, but sometimes in undergraduate training, just because of the size of um, undergraduate majors, you might not get a sense of that. So, one of the things that we're going to do in this course is try to move to a smaller context. So we limited the size of this course. So there's the sections are only 15 people, and we'll probably have you do some things in dyads so that the learning that you're engaging is just not in the abstract, but there's a relational component to it. So I think one way just to kind of catch the stream, or kind of the goals of our course, it might actually be to read the grant proposals that Sally and I wrote. And you can kind of get a sense of what we pitched. There's probably some drift in the specifics, but you'll definitely get a sense of some of the things that we were hoping to accomplish. And I'll mention a few things, and then when we have our retreat day, we can kind of spend some more time uh, talking about some of these. If there's anything that kind of came up that you're interested in hearing more about, we can kind of make time for that. But I would say the biggest emphasis that I would have of how I think about teaching a course is I don't just want to talk at people. I want to invite people into um, a creative process of trying to solve certain kinds of problems. So I want to invite you into the same questions that I think are interesting. And if things go well, it will be interesting for you too. So just to give you an example, when I started doing work on humility, the problem that got me kind of intrigued was um, there are various literatures on other things like forgiveness and gratitude, but the field was kind of stuck at the beginning because no one was quite sure how to measure humility. And the problem was, it was almost kind of a joke. So if I were to ask you, "Are you a humble person?" and you said, "Well, thanks for asking. I'm actually like a 10 out of 10 in humility. I'm one of the most humble people I know." There's something about answering the question and saying you're really high in humility that almost seems paradoxical, like you're bragging. And so the field was, kind of stuck with that. It's like, oh shoot, there's actually some different writers who said something like that. Like, so Ben Franklin has, he worked really hard to kind of uh, achieve moral uh, improvement, and had a whole kind of tracking system that he did. And there's a place where he comments on humility is challenging because even if you were making progress, you might start to become proud of your humility. Um, there's a Christian writer, C.S. Lewis, who has a number of kind of pithy quotes related to the paradoxes of humility. So these kind of lay ideas about how humility might be paradoxical really dominated the first 10 years of work in humility. And I got interested in that problem. Um, when we do our retreat day, I can kind of give you, um, the short version of what happened and how we sort of resolved that problem. But I'm kind of flagging a few things like this in our asynchronous materials, just to invite you to kind of say, well, what would you do if you had come into our research team around 2006 and this problem wasn't solved? What kind of things would you think about? Um, well, similarly with this course, there are some larger problems that I see as I'm kind of mid-career. I've been in my current job about 15 years, and I'll probably, I'm 44 right now. So, I'll probably work for at least another 15 or 20 years. So I'm somewhere around halftime. Um, and so there's an author I like. Stephen Covey wrote a book called Seven Habits of Highly Effective People, where he basically says anything that's going to happen in the real world has to first happen. It has a first creation in someone's mind. It's a work of imagination. So I wanted to give you some of the problems that our research team is wanting to potentially address. Um, so, I do work on humility. There's a line of work we have on cultural humility. How do you train people to kind of be prepared um, to do cross-cultural work and to earn trust with people who are coming from a different cultural background? And um, my initial, area of expertise, I kind of broadened it in my doctoral studies, but I did a master's in kind of how to integrate counseling for people who are religious or spiritual, and that also includes people who may have left religion, or how do you adapt counseling to people who might have been hurt by religion. They might be atheists or agnostic, or there are some people just who prefer to say nothing in particular, but basically just attending to that existential aspect of people's lives. That was an area of interest, and um, it's interesting if you were to kind of look at this literature for over 20 years, people have kind of talked about how there's a lack of attention to this area. And I would say it hasn't changed that much since I came into the field. There's kind of a similar sense if you were to go through the average counseling program, at least in terms of the courses that you would take, you might have a course on multicultural training, and within that course you might have a day or a half day that focuses on different kind of religious traditions and perspectives, but there's not a ton of training. And if you were also to look at like people who go to seminary, or kind of get religious training, and who might operate in a counseling role within kind of a religious tradition, they'll often only get very minimal training on counseling skills. And so there actually does seem to be this kind of gap. And so some of what we're doing with this course is, um, we want to make it less segmented. What would it look like if, um, if we were to kind of have a more integrative approach to thinking about culture that made it seem easier and help people feel more comfort engaging existential kinds of questions. And so where I would see an undergrad course fitting in is you might be considering different careers in psychology, and so this is almost the start of a very long bridge. So if I were to kind of draw a picture of all the different phases um, of a career, this is kind of towards the beginning where you start to um, develop interest and start to explore what it might look like to have a career in psychology or counseling. Um, so another question we have is what would it look like if the process of just navigating a career was easier to navigate? So there are a few places where it can just be kind of hard to get connected. What if it were easier to kind of get connected to strong lifelong friendships? And, that's part of what makes the whole process fun and gives you motivation. So I played football in college, and I remember one of the hardest parts of my uh, career, kind of learning to train, was in high school. We would I had a coach, Coach Hightower, who would pick us up even in eighth grade. Me and a couple of friends in my neighborhood. He'd pick us up, bring us to the high school. We'd work out with the team, and then he would bring us over to the middle school. And he continued to do that. 6 a.m. workouts all through high school, and um, it really made it easier to engage the process of training because all we had to do was kind of show up, and then we got involved with this group that provided the relational connection and community that would kind of push forward the work. So the one part that was hard is the summer before I started college, they basically just sent me a book with my workouts. And it was really, really challenging to kind of force myself. I had some weights in the garage. I didn't have access to the high school gym. It was just kind of a brutal process. I think I generally did what I was supposed to do, sort of. But I could tell that I was missing a component. And I think that some of the different phases that happen, certainly within people's first 10 years of a career in psychology, it needs to be, uh, there needs to be an easier way for people to get connected and kind of find those strong friendships that will motivate the work. This could include if you're, becoming a professor and you're getting support for like grant writing and, writing papers. I think the same is true for people who are starting like a private practice in counseling. Sometimes people, as they get out of their training programs, can start to feel more isolated and may not have um, a group of 5 to 10 people that they can kind of talk about things that are coming up. Um, so this is one of the things that we're wanting to invite you into thinking about. I'm the leader of the Happy Lab. We've got a number of doc students and master students who are helping with this course. Um, but we need your help to kind of think about what would it look like if that first phase of a career where you're starting to, you're going to get a psych major or you're starting to dabble in just taking some psych related courses. But what would it really look like if you were to consider investing more of your life in some of these things? I remember um, when I was kind of considering options, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I kind of figured I would take a job in, um, somewhere in New York, do something to kind of pay off some of my student loans. And I did a master's in counseling kind of for quirky reasons. My mom was sick with ovarian cancer, and so I came home to spend time with her, and she was doing a program in counseling, and I wanted to spend more time with her. And I was like, shoot, couldn't hurt for me to develop more, kind of people skills, no matter what I decide to do. But then I got into it and um, just got more and more interested. And one step at a time, you end up living out a career. So I remember that phase, and it's kind of hard. You're trying to figure out um, all the things you could do, what are you going to do? And there's a discernment process. You're kind of weighing different things, like how much money do I want to make? What kind of work-life balance do I want? How much am I going to kind of enjoy the actual work? And do people seem happy who are in these different kind of professions? So um, this is something that we want to invite you into. Um, you'll see within the approach that we're taking, we're relying heavily on some ideas on expertise development, and I'm happy to talk more about kind of where this comes from. But if there are studies on people who become really excellent at different things like chess or running or flying airplanes. And in that line of work, they've come up with this kind of phrase. So it's not just logging hours that helps you get better. It's not practice that makes perfect. You actually need a specific kind of practice and for anyone who's kind of trained in music, or if you know, played tennis from when you were a young age, you'll recognize these patterns. But basically, you also need a coach, or sometimes it's actually a group of people that are kind of functioning in a coaching kind of way. And so what you do is you're practicing and you're kind of doing these kind of incremental things that help you build skill, and you're giving it intense focus. And then there's a processing of that experience where you're looking for ways that you can kind of continue to prove. And so what am I going to practice next? And so um, there are some, really powerful examples where if people apply this process, they're going to get better and better. So we really want to integrate some of the principles of deliberate practice into the way that we approach teaching this course and kind of engaging our creative work together. The other thing that I'll mention is we're looping back into this course some of the things that were most helpful to me, Josh Hook, and Daryl Van Tongeren. And we went through Virginia Commonwealth University, a doctoral program there together, and we ended up writing a book that's kind of focused on um, graduate school. But I really want to loop back some of the same principles of what was it that was most helpful for us in kind of navigating these early career phases. And it really does align with what I just described about expertise development. So you need some sort of weekly cadence with a mentor, or perhaps another, it could be another student in this course will kind of probably pair you up and do some processing, kind of in dyads. Um, there's probably something good about having like a monthly cadence with other people doing something similar, and so that starts to kind of give you the benefit of like networking effects, and you can kind of connect with other people who are doing something similar. And so instead of having to do things the hard way, you're starting to grow a group of people who, if you kind of bump into a problem, you can shoot them an email and say, "Hey, how should I think about this?" Um, and then there's also some things that might be on a yearly cadence. So, for example, um, the some of the strongest professional friendships that I've developed, there's some sort of getting away from the normal uh, pace of work and taking a day or two in person to spend time with people. And so Daryl and Josh and I, for example, would do we called it a research retreat, and once a year we would just go somewhere nice, a lake, or somewhere in California, and we would just take a couple of days. And part of it was just hiking, and we would spend time together and just kind of shift out of our normal pace. But we'd usually take an hour or two and just talk with each other about what our goals were for the next year. And especially pre-tenure, we would talk with each other about some of the things that we could do that would support each other. So, one year we agreed we were going to each submit a certain number of articles, and we kind of brainstorm different ways that um, our work could kind of coordinate with each other. Um, so, in this course, we're inviting you into the same process that our doctoral program has, and we have master students kind of engaged in that same structure. But even though many universities are kind of moving towards scaling up and, these larger undergrad courses, and you can kind of collect more tuition if you kind of make things online. To be honest with you, I think there will always kind of be a limit of that. And at some point, what people need to get better and to train is actually to get into these groups. Like, think about the military. People are in groups of 8 to 12 people. So these units of, kind of strong professional friendship. I think that's always going to be what it looks like to get better at something. And so we've structured this course so that you can kind of learn about our way of learning and kind of navigating an early career phase. And even if you don't decide not to pursue a career in psychology, I suspect that what you learn about how our team is kind of structuring our creative work and giving, kind of a relational accountability, it will potentially help you think about how to thrive in your career choice. So I'll kind of stop there. Um, but a couple of questions that you can kind of bring to retreat day. Um, I'll give you one that'll just be kind of fun. See if you can use ChatGPT or whatever you have, and estimate how lucrative the positive psych industry is. That's the first one. A second is, I mentioned the problem with humility measurement. Can you think of a way to address that? I can kind of tell you what the field did. Um, and then a last one is, is there anything about, kind of the first creation, the imagining that we're doing as our the Happy Lab and our team? Is there any part of kind of the problems that we're looking at that you find most interesting? So, for example, are you interested in cross-cultural training? Could be in business, could be in helping professions like teaching or nursing or counseling and psychology. Are you interested in problems related to career and, like, what would it look like to try to enjoy a career, not only be successful, but find it deeply fulfilling? So, um, yeah, thanks for considering these, and we'll look forward to discussing that with you. Okay, so what is positive psychology? Um, we have a few things that I wanted you to read just to get a sampling. So I included Seligman's kind of seminal article, kind of laying out a vision for positive psychology. I also have a more recent article where he's just kind of describing his career in retrospect. So that'll give you some sampling of this one particular psychologist at Penn University who's accredited with founding the positive psychology movement. And he attracts much more of the criticism than anybody else. So in this first module, we're using the cultural and humanities critiques of positive psychology to frame the rest of the course. So, as a counseling psychologist, cultural critiques have kind of always been a key part of the field. So it's actually kind of funny. My when in my first semester at Virginia Commonwealth University, I had a couple of courses with Steve Danish, and this was maybe 2 or 3 years after the positive psych movement was kind of getting going, as I was coming through, and my mentor was attracted to kind of frame his work under this umbrella. But Steve Danish thought that counseling psychology had, really invented positive psych long before Seligman came along, and every time he would see me, that's basically what he would say is like, counseling psychology, we've been doing this for a long time. If you ever decide to enter a counseling psych program, you'll probably have a course that gives you kind of a history. And I mean, it really does go back to around World War II when counseling psychologists were involved in supporting um, veterans. They were involved in vocational counseling, and so in a lot of ways, instead of just focusing on kind of severe mental illness, counseling psychologists have critiqued too much alignment with the medical model, and have wanted to have a more strength focused approach. And a key part of our brand is an emphasis on attending to cultural differences and how interventions may need to be focused. Um, so this this is kind of interesting, that there's a movement that comes along decades after a number of other subfields have had something like a strength focus. Developmental psych could claim something similar. If you actually look in personality and social psychology, some of the major research programs in positive psychology had kind of already started in the 80s. So, like, for example, Diener's work on life satisfaction. But there was something really powerful about what Seligman did, and for me, the part of his logic that's kind of stuck with me is he talks about how the funding of NIH had kind of distorted the focus of the field, and so many literatures had kind of framed their applied focus on problems in society. And his initial part of his career had focused on learned helplessness in the context of depression. And as in terms of just applying this heuristic to his own research program, he's like, we really don't understand how to help people with depression unless we also understand what it looks like for people to thrive. We don't want to just move people from symptoms of depression to kind of languishing. We actually want to understand the full spectrum of human experience. And so I actually think that that was a pretty helpful heuristic. So you can look at any field and say, to what extent has kind of a problem focus dominated the storylines and where people are focusing their attention? And is there room to kind of find questions that are on the other side of the spectrum? And you really, in intervention work, prevention kind of fits within a similar kind of frame. And yet again, that's another counseling psychology kind of area of focus. What's challenging about prevention is it can be very expensive. So if you thought about, serving the whole U.S. society, one way to fund something would just be to only focus on the people who really need help, and they really need help because they end up kind of in a category of having really high levels of suffering. So let's say just really severe depression. On the flip side, if you're aiming at prevention, let's say you realize, well, you can prevent depression if you focus on these sets of issues while people are in first grade. Okay, that is a lot of people that you would potentially be serving, and so it creates a little bit of a challenge in terms of how to allocate resources when you start to shift towards more of a prevention mindset. So there are a number of challenges that I think make it hard to kind of make this shift from problem focus to strength focus, and I think that's a key kind of driving question that was kind of clarified by Seligman's line of logic. So part of how we're approaching this course is, we want to change our approach based on some of the critiques that have come about. So, I mean, we assigned kind of a systematic review. There are hundreds of papers now from the first 20 years plus. There's a scholar who declared kind of a second wave positive psych that instead of just focusing on positives, it's more dialectical. So we focus on kind of the balance of positive and negative, but it's more holistic. And then a third wave that shifts the focus to issues of generalizability and systems and kind of integrating even some of counseling psychology's focus on institutional and systemic ways of thinking about problems. So there's quite a bit that we could engage and look at. And so um, what we want to do is help you start to think more like a psychologist about some of these things. So when you were in eighth grade, you might just read a textbook and just, the author says something and you just kind of believe it. Part of what happens as you go to university and especially as you get into a graduate program is we're trying to teach you to have your own perspective. And part of what you need is a little bit of intellectual distance. So you need to kind of be able to hear something, but also see where there might be room to improve it, to kind of consider what might be missing. So to give you an example, we in the slide deck, we've got 4 different books that are kind of positive psychology related texts that have been integrated into courses at major universities, some of them kind of elite universities. So for example, Design Your Life comes from a course offered at Stanford. The Good Life Method is from a course at Notre Dame. Build the Life You Want is a book that Arthur Brooks wrote with Oprah. So another example. And then Life Worth Living, the one that we're kind of using for this course, is based on a course taught at Yale. So the question that we want you to kind of consider throughout this course is, where might we be missing something even in how this course is taught at some of these different universities? Where is it that a focus on kind of 18 to 25-year-olds at some of these kind of elite universities, Stanford, Yale, Harvard has a version of a positive psych course, Notre Dame. It's kind of like people are they worked really hard, maybe too hard, to get into the university that they wanted, but then there's kind of an existential vacuum that's happening, and it's like, whoa, what do I do? And I could do a lot of things. What's worth doing? But as a counseling psychologist, there's a lot more to life than just making decisions when you're kind of 22 years old. And so I think that it might be helpful to kind of look at this body of work and say, where might we be missing something? So I'll kind of ask you as you prepare for the retreat day, just, you don't have to read all these books. We don't have time, but you could kind of skim the table of contents and just, get the gestalt of how some of these books are being focused. And you could probably assume the courses kind of have a similar framing. What do you think's missing? I can share, some of my own thoughts when we have a chance to gather. But what I thought I would start with is I want to kind of give you 3 almost like haunting questions or issues that I had a little bit when I started, and they just haven't gone away. And so I'm starting to wonder if these are things that might just kind of stick with me my whole career. So one is there any way that as we come to our work as kind of, psychologists and counselors, we want to kind of loosen our, we want to be open-minded. We want to be culturally able to kind of extend grace and space for different values and different perspectives. But also, there are some things that we might just consider wrong. And we don't want to have a totally nihilistic worldview perspective. That's at least, let me speak for myself. Like that's my perspective. And so I had an experience. It was maybe a year ago, and um, I kind of I pulled the audio from a talk that I gave where I was kind of describing this experience. But it was basically watching a show with my kids where people were kind of engaged in the wild, and it illustrated for me this challenge. And I guess the fundamental question that I ended up kind of having is, how is it that coming from different cultural perspectives, we can still somehow bolster the idea that we're going to treat each other as having really, really high value, and we're not going to treat each other with kind of a survival of the fittest kind of logic? That was kind of that kind of haunts me because, long story short, I don't think there's anything specific to the discipline of psychology that answers that question. And so philosophers and theologians would say that's kind of a normative question. We basically have to bring that from our different cultures, and we have to bring that commitment in different ways to our work with each other, because I don't see a way that just the discipline of psychology can kind of bolster that. Some people talk about human rights or human dignity, but that seems really, really important, and it seems foundational, especially when you're working with clients, that you have a commitment to treating people as highly valuable. But I also have kind of these haunting moments. So that's one.
I was watching a show called Something Bit Me with my kids. Have y'all heard of this? It's Disney Plus. It's not a kid show. Everyone survives, but it's basically like people going into the wild and having encounters with nature and animals that can bite you. So basically, there's one story where someone goes into the Arctic, a part of Canada that was extremely remote, and there's like basically you're supposed to go with a native Canadian because only native Canadians are allowed to bring a gun. But this group of campers just decided that they were good, and they built a electric fence around their camp, and a polar bear came. And they gave a little bit about polar bears. Polar bears are huge. They're one of the biggest predators, and they need a lot of calories. And they were kind of describing how many calories they need. And then you basically see that, oh, a polar bear thought of humans as calories. And I just had a really haunting feeling like, shoot, how is it that we know that humans have a kind of value where it's wrong to treat another person poorly, when there's another account that morality is just whatever we agree to, it's basically a social contract or something like that. And all it takes for that to fall through is for one partner to say, well, I've been a good person most of my life, but no thanks for now. They basically take the polar bear clause. It's like, well, today I'll be a predator, and what you have is what I want. Basically, it's a version of what happened with Josh, where he's like, well, I like the idea that we would both really try to attend to each other's interests, but right now, one of us gets the golf clubs and one of us doesn't, and I'll take me this time. My answer to that is I'm going to reject moral nihilism, and I'm going to do the very best I can to reject that. And I mean, if you want to know at the heart of it, I mean, I'm Christian. I don't think that I get to say I'll walk away. I think I'll have to give an account for if I treat someone like a polar bear. So I can actually get to a place where my belief in that value is strong, but then I've got a lot of evidence that I'm actually weak in my execution of living up to that ideal. There's a lot of that within Christian history of art. So we have psychological problems of executing even our highest ideals. So for me, I think I have a problem of executing on the values that I want to have. But I guess I've kind of thought of it like I think it would violate a value for me to coerce someone else to share my views. So basically, my bid is, how close can you get to viewing humans as not treating each other like polar bears. And honestly, I think as a public space, I think we should get as close to that commitment as we can from different viewpoints. But I'm actually not sure. I mean, I guess the practical answer is I basically am responsible for my view of that. But I guess what I would say is I don't think my view of that has any causal effect on what's actually true morally. And so I think that kind of levels the playing field. So if you say, well, actually, the world's like polar bears, there's a parable of the talents, and that was actually the view of the person. They basically said, I thought you were this cruel master. Or, I mean, even worse, I thought there was no one in charge. Okay. I mean, basically, that's either true or it's not. So from my perspective, the fact that you say there's no moral accountability, that's totally orthogonal to whether there's actually moral accountability. Anyway, that's one take on it. But
feeling is when we're kind of thinking of our work as helpers. I write lots of papers on positive psychology. There are some questions that science can't fully answer. It is a limited tool. It's a very powerful tool, but with certain kinds of things, it it has to be somewhat silent. So I guess the analogy I think of is like if I was at the Grand Canyon and I look out across the expanse, I can see quite a bit, but then there is a horizon line, and the world is much bigger. We happen to know than as far as we can see, as far as the eye can see, and so that kind of gives me an analogy of I can tell that there are basically questions in psychological science and really science in general where we really don't know. And so, I do work on intellectual humility. I think that concept of being aware that there is a point where we kind of, science can only take us so far, and there are some questions that science can't answer. Um, One example, I can kind of give you the episode and timestamp. Um, but I kind of I listen to a broad range of podcasts. I find it's kind of a good way to sample different perspectives. So I can listen to, for example, the Supreme Court. I can listen to more conservative views of the Supreme Court. I can listen to more progressive kind of critiques of the Supreme Court, and try to get a sense for the range of ideas before I try to kind of form my own ideas. And so I like podcasts. There was one where they were basically talking about the limits of what we know about how the universe came into being, and I was like, "Yep, that's a good example." And they were basically saying there comes a point, no matter how far back you go in time, where physicists are just guessing. They give it their best guess, but there's actually not a great way to know for sure exactly what happened. When you go far enough back, you just have range of plausible guesses, and some of the guesses start to kind of, uh, they blow your mind basically. So I also subscribe to like great courses, and I kind of like listening to some of those science-based episodes where they kind of take you to the limit of what is known, and then you realize, oh shoot, there's quite a bit more that's unknown than known, and all of our areas of knowledge hit this kind of point of mystery. And when I was younger, I used to kind of get frustrated by some of those kinds of questions. When we do our retreat, I'm happy to kind of talk more about some examples, but some of them are like personal faith related processes where I ran into these kind of questions, and it really bothered me until somewhere along the line, I was able to kind of talk with someone who encouraged me to view those mysteries as not something to be scared of or really try to ever master, but to kind of have a sense of awe when you kind of start to encounter those limits. So that's kind of a haunt that I've also learned to befriend as much as I can. And then the last one is the realization that in my role as a psychologist, especially working with clients or students, all of our clients, when they're in major pain from grief or trauma, they end up having some big questions that science can't fully address. So, I mean, just to give you kind of a personal example, when my mom was sick, I was also in this counseling program and I was doing a helping skills course where I was practicing learning how to, do basic counseling. So you kind of learn to reflect the content of what someone said in your own words, and it kind of lets the person know you're listening, and also they have a chance to correct you. You also learn to reflect the feelings that you imagine they're having, and you're kind of checking those out with them too. And so you're kind of mirroring. So this is kind of a core skill that later on you learn more specific techniques to deal with different kinds of problems. But it's almost like the blocking and tackling of counseling work. It's like going back to the basics. So I was kind of practicing this. I had waited too long to do my assignment and had run out of people to do. It was kind of due the next day, and so I was practicing with my mom while she was sick and really dealing with existential issues of what's it like to realize that she's towards the end of her life. We had kind of run out of options for treatment. She was still doing okay, and hadn't hit kind of the harder part of the illness that would kind of happen within the next year. But she was starting to kind of hit a phase of the process where she realized that medicine wasn't going to heal her, and she was, kind of getting ready for the likelihood that she was going to die sooner than she thought. And I can go back to that session. I actually have it still recorded, and sometimes I go back and listen to it. Thankfully, I have some other audio from her in other parts of her life, but I do like to go back and kind of hear her voice and listen to that. And it's an example where if you were kind of to look at the transcript, and I'm happy to kind of show y'all the feedback I got from my instructor in that course. It's kind of funny and it puts it into perspective. But the technique of cognitive behavioral therapy, or some of these different traditions, there's a point where you're moving beyond just what can be known from science and into something more deeply human, to sit with someone in an existential process and kind of thinking about what their life means, what their dreams are for their life. And so, to kind of synthesize that concept, clients have big questions that science can't fully answer. And so I think part of training as someone who's interested in a helping profession is there's an intellectual humility to knowing that there's a limit to what science can do. So, I mean, as a simple description, I mean, it's a process of kind of testing out our ideas, but there are some ideas where we can't fully know the answer because we don't really have a way to work it out. I'm going to give you another kind of somewhat silly example. I get grant funding from the Templeton Foundation, and I remember one of the program officers describing a project where they were going to kind of try to scientifically see what was going on with these out-of-body experiences with people having near-death experience. And I can't remember. There was a book I read where they actually described the results of this line of studies, and it was kind of cool. But basically, what they were going to do is in this setting that was treating people kind of, who would, within a year, you would have a certain number of people who technically died, but then they were able to revive them back to life. And if, they had this experience of kind of looking down on their body, what they did is in this room, they put like a marking on, above this bar that was kind of over the bed. And they were going to basically see, when people came back, to their body, a sense of coming back to their body, were they able to kind of identify what was on top of this bar that was kind of over the bed or whatever? I didn't see the room, but I was imagining like you kind of have a room and you have kind of a crossbar, you know, that is kind of at the level of the wall, and then maybe the ceiling goes up above that bar or something like that. I mean, that's my imagination of how it was set up. Um, so I mean, as far as I know, that study didn't work. But this is an example where you're kind of trying to get to the limit of what can be known about these kinds of things. Well, you know, there's a whole area of psychology that's kind of somewhere playing around with that limit. You know, in my work on studying religion spirituality, there's a line of work of like, can you culturally adapt cognitive therapy to Christians or to Muslims, and that generally works. People like that better. It doesn't necessarily improve the outcomes of the therapy, but there's a whole other kind of body of work where they literally tried to test, you know, does prayer work? You know, so if you kind of pray for randomly assign people to pray or not pray for a person, does that work? And I mean, it, you know, it almost, at least to me, it almost seems a little bit silly because you might be able to randomly assign some people to pray, but you never know if other people in that person's life are also praying. I mean, you know, the God or the sacred could answer anybody's prayer. So it seems kind of difficult to randomly assign religious things of that kind. Um, so um, anyway, if you were to go look up some of the reviews of this work, they did end up finding that knowing you were prayed for, and especially you know, if you had people who were kind of with you, and if there was kind of you know, their loved ones, and there's touch involved in the process of prayer, they did find some benefits of that. And so there, you know, some people's interpretation was there are kind of psychological benefits of some of these religious practices, so we can kind of start to get at thing like consequences of what it, you know, what we think about religious things, or things like virtue, or you know, kind of normative concepts that are studied within positive psych. But there is still a limit that some things we can't actually get at with the scientific method, and I suspect there in some ways the challenges, you know, there are lots of movements within psychology. There does seem something unique about the amount of critique that's being generated in positive psychology. Part of me wonders if part of what's going on is that it really is kind of sitting at the boundary of what can be known using scientific methods. So, and you know, in particular, when a psychologist kind of claims to know more than they could, and oversteps that boundary, I think it's possible that you know, those things are even more contested, because it's like, whoa, that's not fair. You can't actually make claims about that because that's beyond what we can know. So anyway, that's kind of an overview of the three haunts that are kind of informing my framing of this course. I would encourage you to think: are there any kinds of questions you have as you engage psychology that are, you know, kind of similar to what I'm saying? They're like haunts, you know, almost like existential questions that you wonder if there might be kind of a limit. And I think it'd be helpful just for us to kind of share those with each other as we engage some of the themes from the rest of this course. Okay, in this section, if we're going to use critiques of positive psychology to kind of learn about this subfield, I wanted to start with a systematic review written by Van Zyl and a cadre of co-authors. So we assigned this reading. Do what you can with it. Skim it. It should be somewhat accessible, but if you kind of get stuck, just keep going. See what you can do with it. But the general gist is a systematic review is what happens when someone does a study of studies, and sometimes you can quantitatively synthesize findings. So, for example, we could see how effective forgiveness interventions are and convert that into an effect size, such as a correlation. You might have learned about that. So, how much does forgiveness being assigned to a forgiveness intervention change on outcomes like stress or depression or psychological well-being? And you can kind of combine those effects quantitatively. The other type of review is the part that makes it systematic is you're telling people exactly what you did to find the studies or the articles, and it should be detailed in a way that other people could replicate it. But then there's a more qualitative approach to trying to make sense of what's there. So this review by Van Zyl is a qualitative systematic review, or some people call it a narrative review. But they end up, finding hundreds of critiques, and they kind of, with a team, classify these into different subgroups, and they give kind of, they use a figure of a tree to kind of illustrate these different critiques. So that's a good starting place. Other people could kind of do this a different way. I kind of tried to simplify a little bit, and I wanted to use an interdisciplinary kind of lens. So I think there are basically, if you put 5 different kind of types of critique on a spectrum, I think the first 2 are just completely within the realm of psychological science, and then 3, 4, and 5 start to kind of pull in interdisciplinary kinds of critiques, which I think part of what that means is psychological science alone is not going to fully resolve some of the issues being raised. And so it can save us time and energy just to understand that when we're starting to kind of get towards a horizon line of what can be known, that we should have different expectations of how those debates or kind of different perspectives are going to resolve. So I'll kind of go through those, and we're going to use these kind of tools to kind of look at different findings throughout the rest of the course. So the first is, some people just say, hey, positive psych, these things aren't working. Like, it doesn't matter that much. So if you look at some of Seligman's interventions, compared to other approaches, the effect sizes in some cases are smaller than you'd want them to be. At one point, I did a meta-analysis of gratitude interventions, and kind of had a pithy title, Thankful for the Little Things. It turns out the gratitude interventions, although people had kind of talked about how powerful this was for promoting benefits, and I think it is. And if you look at, correlational data, people who are much more grateful are higher in, better health, mental health, those kind of outcomes, better relationships. But if you actually look at the intervention research, how much are people moving when they kind of do these different practices, the effect sizes were pretty small. In other cases, so for example, my mentor's work on forgiveness, if you look at the intervention work there are pretty impressive effects from forgiveness for health, mental health, relationships, and even spiritual well-being. And so the results of that meta-analysis are published in one of the top clinical psych journals. That paper is now about 10 years old, but those are pretty impressive findings. So that's a case where, in some cases, positive psych work is potentially making a big difference. In other cases, the hoopla around constructs might not be commensurate with the actual findings. The second is, how well do the findings replicate? And especially kind of third wave positive psychology, an issue being raised is a lot of psychology is focused on the United States or parts of Europe, and there needs to be a globalization of science on within positive psychology. We don't want to just study. There's one paper where they talk about weird samples. So Western educated, industrialized, uh, weird industrialized. I forget what the R is, and then the D is democratic. So anyway, there's a need to see if the results in some cultural contexts extend to other cultural contexts. That's still purely within the realm of psychological science. So that's an issue of external validity. And in a lot of cases, there's a trade-off between internal validity and external validity. What we mean by that, if you haven't taken kind of a research methods course in psychology yet, internal validity has to do with, I'll give you an example. If you're doing an experiment and you set up the conditions and you're trying to establish causality, so let's say we manipulate whether you get a forgiveness intervention or not. If I can control for all other things except for what's being manipulated in the experiment, then I can kind of rule out threats to internal validity. So I can therefore infer that what's causing changes in the outcome variable, let's say it's anxiety or stress, I can infer that I have high internal validity because I ruled out these other threats, and therefore it's the forgiveness intervention that's causing these changes in stress. So that's still bread and butter psychological science. And if you were to go to a doctoral program, you would learn many, many things about the different types of threat to both internal and external validity. So external validity, a simple way to explain what's going on with external validity is if I were to do a study on, a predominantly white sample in a certain part of Georgia, and then I were to, make the claim that, the results of the study apply to the world, that's probably wrong because the results of my study have implications for the sample being studied, but we don't necessarily have evidence that they extend to other contexts. And so when you go to a literature to kind of review things, what you'll often find is findings in one context and one sample don't necessarily generalize to another context and sample. That's quite common. And kind of failure to attend to the variability that can happen because of differences in who you're studying, and kind of how you are conducting the study. Those kinds of we talk about those as moderators. So it basically changes the relationship of what you're trying to study. So in our example, we're talking about forgiveness and an intervention in forgiveness and how it affects the outcomes. So that might actually happen differently if you do a study in one sample versus another. So number 3, now we're moving into a category where, especially when you're studying things like virtues, like gratitude or forgiveness, we're starting to potentially study things where the definition implies something that kind of goes beyond what can be measured certainly perfectly within psychology. And so you'll end up seeing a similar kind of problem across a variety of different positive psych constructs. And so a simple way to explain it is that there's always kind of a look, here's the dark side of forgiveness, here's the dark side of gratitude. And what they're getting at is, if you were to just look at how a philosopher will define something like forgiveness, they'll basically say you're doing the right thing, you're forgiving in a good way for for the right situation, for the right reasons. So they basically are adding these various qualifiers that say, you're not going to necessarily forgive all the time. It has to be kind of in the right context. And it has to be motivated for the right reasons. Well, it turns out it's easier to say that and to kind of define something that way, but some components of that kind of defining something in a normative way, so this is the way it ought to be done, actually make it difficult, if not probably somewhat impossible, to perfectly measure it psychologically. And so you end up having to kind of sacrifice. And so, for example, if you were to look at measures of forgiveness, what you're actually measuring is how much a person reports feeling different aspects of unforgiveness. And so then forgiving is a movement away from high unforgiveness towards lower unforgiveness. But if you look, there's a line of studies by McNulty that say, well, look, in couples that are kind of experiencing, if one of the partners is low in agreeableness, so they're, kind of an untrustworthy person, then it can actually be to your disadvantage to forgive a lot because it can kind of make the other person more likely to exploit the relationship. So kind of showed some evidence of this problem. Well, it turns out you can kind of look for that with any so-called virtue. So are there times where, for example, being really, really high and chronically grateful might actually set you up and put you in harm's way? Um, we'll revisit these kinds of issues a little more. So let's call it the third chapter, we'll talk more about those kinds of issues. But from my perspective, that's a limitation so far in work in positive psychology, because we all understand that there are some times where you might do the right thing and you might be encountering negative consequences. So consequences alone don't tell you whether something is good, whether it's right. So there's an element of virtue that is actually difficult to fully get at. So this step 3 is kind of starting to dip into an area where we reach the limits of what psychological science can do. The fourth is specifically issues related to power and abuse of power. And so I end up letting y'all hear a podcast by Stacey Floyd Thomas. She's one of the people that I had a chance to meet when I did a consultation up at Yale. And I remember her kind of giving a critique of humility where she was saying, depending on the cultural context, not all groups are going to kind of talk about humility in the same way. And there's actually, she's a theologian and also works within the Black church. So she kind of gave examples where the virtue language that is taught and kind of emphasized within the Black church, it has a different way of framing, because part of the way that virtue language is working when people are preaching is to kind of help inoculate people from internalized racism. And there's kind of a wish and a kind of community strength and resource where if you talk about something like humility, it's going to be talked about in a way that differentiates from the dominant culture so that people aren't prone to kind of assimilation pressure where, it's like, okay, I'm going to basically be humble, but in a way that is overly harmful to the self. I would encourage you to kind of listen to some of her critique and perspective on that, but this is something that you really could take any virtue within positive psychology and you could look for, how do we need to contextualize the power dynamics that happen around this virtue. And so from my perspective, that makes this very interesting, and it's always going to be present that we have to attend to the relative power that different people have. You could also think just like within a family. So, within a typical family, like I was the oldest son, and I had 3 younger siblings. So within a thriving family, if you kind of look at family systems kind of literature, a good family leaves room for people to kind of be part of a family culture and to do some things for the collective. But there's also a balance of helping people develop their own strengths and unique perspectives, and there's space for people to kind of have a balance of sacrifice for the family and loyalty to the family, but also there's room for people to kind of pursue their own interests and development. And so, with any of these literatures, I think we can attend to some of those dialectics that have to do with power dynamics. And then the fifth area is existential critiques. And what I mean by that, more than just issues of, so if you read like Yalom, he has a book that was written the year before I was born, where he talks about givens of existence, death, human freedom, that we make choices and we don't always know, what's right or kind of fate or God's will. So there's some sense of human freedom. There's a sense of isolation. So even though we can have connection in relationship, at some level, we can't fully understand each other, and there's room for misunderstanding. And so therefore, there's this potential for a real sense of loneliness at times, existentially. Um, and then also, there's a sense of meaninglessness. So, because there are different kind of worldview perspectives, and no perspective has the ability to kind of show itself the best of all to all people, and is fully convincing to everyone. There can be an existential sense of, well, what if what if there's an inherent meaninglessness of life, and so that kind of haunting sense of meaningless is kind of an existential given that we all might grapple with. So those are kind of the content areas, and there are whole like philosophical traditions that are kind of framed within existentialism. What I mean by kind of existential critiques is probably closer to in Life Worth Living. When we talk about core principles, the first person component, and maybe even the community of practice component. So, what are the things that are critiques, but we can't afford to just take an objective third person perspective? At some level, we are part of the process as being human. We have to grapple with these issues, and there's not really a way to fully step outside the question. We're actually addressing things that are fundamental to being human. And so, like, when I mentioned kind of the three haunts that I have, it would be kind of that third one, that when we each encounter things like grief and trauma, we are going to end up having some questions or protests that kind of go beyond what science alone can answer, and they kind of get into something that is more fundamental to being human. So I'll kind of stop there. When we have our retreat day, I want to kind of use maybe 10 minutes of our time just to bring things back together and give some ideas. So I kind of called it under the bucket of how now shall we live, but what are the implications for how we're going to kind of approach this course, given some of the themes that I've kind of raised in this first chapter. So thank you.